Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Gray Matter. I'm kind of pumped about today's show because I think with our guest, we're going to get to stir the pot a little bit. It's something that he tends to do, but oftentimes in a provocative but also a very profound way. Our guest is the third member of a group called the Frontier Center for Public Policy, of which I'm proud to be a member. And just by way of giving them a plug, they are, I think, one of the best sources you'll find anywhere, particularly on the internet, for sources of commentary, conservative commentary on topics of interest, ranging from politics to culture, literature, art. Just a really, really fascinating place to go and read things. And as I said, today's guest has been a very, very steadfast contributor to that. His name is Dale Giesbrecht. By way of introduction, as we always do, I've got a few aphorisms that have been chosen somewhat in his honor. And I say his honor particularly because the man we have today was a judge for 31 years in Manitoba, a very distinguished career in and of itself. And so our first quotation is from a famous judge. I'm sure Brian will know him well or remember him well. The famous Alfred Baron Denning from the House of Lords in Britain. He famously wrote once that limitation is not a matter of justice, it is a rule of public policy, which has its origin in history and its justification in convenience. I would say that's a very prescient description of what's going on today in Canadian public discourse. The second one, which is kind of a preview of what we're going to be, some of the things we're going to be talking about, and perhaps one of the more controversial topics that we're going to hit upon today, is from the father to our current Prime Minister, the late Pierre Elliott Trudeau. He said this back in August of 1969. So this year we came up with a proposal. It's a policy paper on the Indian problem. It proposes a set of solutions. It doesn't impose them on anybody. It proposes them, not only to the Indians, but to all Canadians, not only to their federal representatives, but to the provincial representatives too. And it says we're at the crossroads. We can go on treating the Indians as having a special status. We can go on adding bricks of discrimination around the ghetto in which they live, and at the same time, perhaps helping them preserve certain cultural traits and certain ancestral rights. Or we can say you're at a crossroad. The time is now to decide whether the Indians will be a race apart in Canada or whether it will be Canadians of full status. Again, that's 53 years ago, just about. But still, words that speak to the fact that very little has been resolved in more than half a century of Canadian politics and history. The final one is from a very famous Indigenous person, American. Most people will know the famous Geronimo. And he said, "Do you know the difference between a resolution and regret? One combines the future and the other to the past." So let's talk about our guest, Dale Giesbrecht. He's, as I said, he's a senior fellow of the Frontier Center for Public Policy, which is a Canadian think tank, for lack of a better description. Brian received his education at United College and the University of Manitoba, where he obtained his law degree in 1972. He worked with a firm called Walsh, Micay and Co, and then joined Legal Aid Manitoba in 1975 to become senior attorney and the first area director for Western Manitoba in Brandon, which incidentally is where my father's from. He was appointed to the Provincial Court Family Division in 1976, which is quite extraordinary. I don't think that happens anymore. As a relatively young lawyer, he went up to the bench, and he heard child welfare cases and general family matters until he transferred to the Criminal Division in 1989. During his career, he served in the National Family Court Committee and various provincial court committees, and he was an associate chief judge from 1991 to 2005, and he became acting chief judge in 1993. Among the notable cases he heard was the Lester Desjarlais Inquiry. His report strongly criticized the government's decision to devolve child welfare responsibilities to racially based child care agencies. That's a practice, by the way, that's continued to this day. Following his retirement from the bench in 2007, Brian has written extensively for various publications, which he's going to tell us about. His main theme has been the abolition of the Indian Act and the separate systems of government that exist in Canada. And I should add here to this biography that he's also been a very outspoken and I would say a profound critic of the policies that have been imposed by Canadian governments, especially the federal government and the provincial government of Manitoba surrounding COVID-19. So, Brian, welcome to the program. It's great to have you on.
Oh, thanks. Nice to be here, Leighton.
All right. So, Brian, we've got that little bit of biography, but before we get into some of your deeper ideas and some of the topics that we want to sort of mine from your vast knowledge and experience, we'd like to maybe get to know you a little bit better. We know you're from Manitoba. We know that you had a very distinguished legal career, but could you tell us a little bit about growing up in Manitoba, your high school days, university and law school, becoming a judge at a very young age and then serving 31 years? What was that like?
Well, I had a normal, I suppose, a normal privileged upbringing. My father was a high school teacher, and my mother taught new Canadians. We started in Arborg, Manitoba. That's where I was born, and moved to the north end of Winnipeg, and soon after that to West Ledonen. And I had what I consider a wonderful childhood. I went to school to West Ledonen Collegiate, and then later to United College, and moved from there directly to United College, which became the University of Winnipeg. And it's interesting, the three quotes you gave, Leighton. Of course, Lord Denning was a great favorite of mine, but Pierre Trudeau actually, when he immediately before pronouncing or coming out with that white paper, he ran for election. I was a student at University of Winnipeg, and that's the only time in my career I've ever actually campaigned for any particular politician. I campaigned for Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and one of the things that made sense to me then, and still makes sense to me, is the idea of equal rights for everybody, and getting rid of the Indian Act in a way that would allow Indigenous people to hang on to as much of their culture as they wanted. So I've never renounced that idea. It's always stayed with me. So that's been it's interesting that you begin the session with a quote from Pierre Trudeau. So nothing particularly interesting. I joined Walsh Micay after law school. Harry Walsh was a famous lawyer, very famous lawyer in Western Manitoba. He's legendary.
Mm-hmm.
I then moved on to Legal Aid, and I opened the first Legal Aid office in Brandon. And yes, I was appointed young. There was a history of young appointments. I was the third in the role of some fairly young appointments. And no, it doesn't happen. No, I shouldn't say that. We just had a very recent, quite young appointment in Brandon as well. So it seems to be a tradition there. And in actual fact, I would argue that that judges should not be. You're probably better off with a person with a lot of energy. And at that time, at least, I had that. But my career consisted of basically half of my time was in the family division, and then I moved over to the criminal division. And much of my work involved Indigenous people, poor Indigenous people. And I was able to come to certain conclusions as I did so. And in fact, one of the reasons I retired relatively early was because I did want to write about some of these issues. I never felt that the system we have in Canada is fair to anybody, particularly to Indigenous youth. So that's where I come from, Leighton, and I'd like to discuss any aspect of that you'd like to.
Well, if I had practiced in Manitoba instead of Alberta, I think I would have been in your court quite regularly and called you Your Honor and Sir, because I spent a lot of my time, my firm has had and still has a contract for the province to do child welfare prosecution. So I'm very familiar with those types of cases. And then I spent a lot of the rest of my time as a full-time criminal law lawyer for many years. So I certainly appreciate how well you would have been acquainted with, the plight and really the struggles of Indigenous peoples in Canada. That's a front row seat to most of the worst case scenarios. Seeing all of the worst problems in the worst possible light when you see them in the courtroom. So I can certainly understand how you would have developed some strong but very informed opinions about about the state of Canada, and particularly Indigenous peoples within Canada. But after you retired in 2007, it's obvious you became writing. You began writing with some vigor. You've written extensively, and there's a lot of your work available online. And I've read much of it, and I think it's exceptional. It's all of your work I find is very thoughtful, written in a way that is well informed, well documented. You're not just going off on a rant. But I want to talk about a couple of things where you maybe poked the bear and maybe did it, deliberately. The first one was back in 2017, in August of 2017. There was a situation where you had penned a controversial column in Thunder Bay, and there was some blowback about this. So something about comparing the rights of status Indians to a gravy train. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that column and how the satire came about?
Yeah, I tried satire, and I even my title was A Modest Proposal, which obviously was.
I've got a quote from Jonathan Swift right behind me. So.
Okay, well,
the stars are aligned.
I thought that was a tip off that what I was writing was satire, and but I meant what I said, and I'm very critical of the idea of status cards, for instance, and special status for Indigenous people. And I'm not being insulting when I make my criticism. I suggested in that article, I even compared it to the South African situation, where you have a special card for if you're one color, and a special card if you're white, and a special card for black people, and that sort of thing. And I was ridiculing the situation, because I do not believe that we should live in a country where people have different rights that depend upon their racial origin at the time of their birth. So yes, I was not being insulting to Indigenous people, but I was definitely insulting the system of apartheid that we have, and I was poking fun at status cards, and I'm saying that no civilized country should have such a thing. And I know that particular column did cause a lot of controversy, but I don't want to apologize for it. I think that what we have right now is a system that's completely unfair, because, just to take one example, income tax exemption for a person, let's say, let's just pick a chief on a reserve, an income tax exemption for a person making a few $100,000 and then compare that to the person who is unemployed on the reserve, who gets zero benefit from an income tax exemption, absolutely none. So you've got a special privilege that is guaranteed, that is simply benefiting people who really don't need it. So I mean, that's just one example, but another would be, and I referred to it in that article, the idea of privileged people being able to send their children to the best universities free of charge, at the expense of the taxpayer. Well, that's not something that that benefits a poor Indigenous person at all, because in fact, very few even graduate from high school. But here you have bureaucrats in Ottawa, and you have the children of wealthy lawyers and that sort of thing, who are able to take advantage of these racial advantages. And I said in that article, that's quite a long time ago, I don't remember exactly what it said, but I was being very critical of all of those special privileges and saying we have to find a fair way to buy out those special privileges so that all Canadians have exactly the same benefits, because we take for granted in Canada that this makes sense, that one group of people should have special privileges, and I say no, we shouldn't. We should be ridding ourselves of such anachronisms.
I think part of what you were saying, though, is that this is very, very bad for the so-called aggrieved population as well. And actually, what you wrote reminded me of some of the things that Thomas Sowell, an American author, has written about the situation of the African American Black people in the United States. And he points to, and you're probably familiar with this, but he's written extensively on this topic, and he's shown using economic data that the affirmative action programs that were developed in the early 1960s have actually done untold harm and destruction to Black families and communities. Whereas when you go back earlier to the 1920s, 1930s, and even through the early post-World War II period, Black families actually had, they were lower in incidence of divorce. They had more contiguous families, and in some parts of the South were flourishing very well in terms of owning businesses and things like that. And that these affirmative action programs that you talk about, the so-called aid that's based upon race, actually does more harm than good. But Brian, my next question for you is, bearing in mind what you've told us about your support for the McDonald-Chrétien white paper of 1969, which, as you know, is very controversial in its own right, are you frustrated at all that here we are 53 years on and really very little positive change has occurred? And in fact, it seems that the situation has gotten much, much worse. I mean, here in Calgary, just last week, the Prime Minister secreted himself in a posh hotel. Nobody knew why, and then we found out after he left that he was here to hand over a $1.3 billion check to a First Nations community that, if anybody went out to look at it, it looks like a third world town in South America. So, are you frustrated at all that so little positive change has occurred in more than a half a century that you've witnessed this problem?
Very frustrated, and I would even go back a bit before the 1969 white paper to the Hawthorne report, and then point to what Harry Hawthorne and Cairns and people like that were saying. They predicted what's happening today, and their prescription at that time for Indian reserves was yes, of course, there are, especially the older people are going to be, and I'm not talking about some of the dynamic communities that are quite productive, Fort McKay and some of these places, but many of the Indigenous communities, we used to call them reserves, but First Nations, will never be economically productive. And the Hawthorne report recognized the fact that what young Indigenous people needed was not more money being dumped into the community, but they needed economic opportunity and incentives and assistance to move to places where they would have better economic opportunities, jobs, etc. And it proposed that, yes, of course, there should be welfare services and social assistance given to people, but not an extravagant amount. In other words, allow people who wanted to stay behind and who didn't feel that they wanted to move to a job center to live decently. Yes, of course, but the last thing they should do is pour huge amounts of money into communities that are never going to be economically viable. But that's exactly what this government has been doing especially since 2015. So you've got billions of dollars. I mentioned the income tax exemption, where you've got even more economic incentives there for people to simply stay there and live in what in many cases are, I don't want to be offensive here, but they're human warehouses. There's no economic reason for those communities to exist. What those young people need is exactly the same as what any young person needs. They need an opportunity to succeed financially and economically with their life. They need a purpose in life, and in many cases, that's not going to be found on the reserve. I live in rural Manitoba, and what I can tell you is that the pattern out here has been the same for the last 100 years or 150 years. Generally, you have some people who stay on the farm and work their farms. You have some people who find jobs in the towns, but many of the young people move to the cities. They go to the universities. They end up going to Calgary, to Winnipeg, or to California, or whatever, because the jobs that they want, the careers that they want, are going to be in the city. And I would argue that that's generally the way things should be. That's a healthy flow of people. Well, what we're doing is we're artificially stopping that flow by simply dumping billions of dollars into uneconomic, unproductive Indigenous communities. I think we're doing a terrible thing for those young people. Yes, you can get some sort of a job working for the band, or you can exist for live your life without doing anything, as many people are doing. But that's not what young people should be doing. It doesn't matter if you're Indigenous or you're not Indigenous. Young people should be aspiring to build careers for themselves. And the simple fact is that if you're a rural Canadian, whether you're an Indigenous rural Canadian or whether you're a non-Indigenous rural Canadian, the dynamics are exactly the same. Most of the career opportunities are going to exist in the city. So yes, I think we're doing exactly the wrong thing by simply transferring, redistributing all of this money and dumping it into communities that are never going to be economically viable.
You make a great point, and just to finish it off, the other side of the coin that I don't think many non-Indigenous people realize is that it's been my experience, and I expect yours is the same, is that Indigenous people, First Nations people, they don't want to live this way. They don't want to hand out. They want to live meaningful lives. They want to have productive work. They want to have families. They want all the same things that every other Canadian wants. And it's not as though you use the phrase gravy train, but I can assure you they don't see it that way. They don't want to live on gravy. They want to have a stake in Canada and to live meaningful lives. And of course, the system robs them of that, and if that leads to despondency, despair, and of course, social calamity and crime and all the things that we see, unfortunately, so prevalent in First Nations communities. And of course, young people, lives being destroyed, cut short through alcoholism, drug abuse, and of course, overrepresentation in our prisons. So you make an excellent point there. The other thing that you've been outspoken about, and this is an extension of this carding system, which fundamentally is racist, is a piece that you wrote in February of last year about the Pretendians. Would you like to talk about that a little bit? The Pretendians, do you recall that piece?
Yes.
Okay.
I was having a bit of fun with it, but it is a serious point. And we've seen a number of examples in the last while of people, academics or I think very recently there was a person working at a senior position in a hospital who sort of outed for not being indigenous or not being indigenous enough.
Right.
Well, I find this to be in some ways almost laughable. But this is what you get when you build a system based on your race. As far as I'm concerned, if you want to get a job as a professor or as a person in a hospital or wherever, your race should be absolutely irrelevant. What should be relevant is whether you're the best person for the job. And it's even quite insulting when you think about it to start hiring people based on their race. And it's even almost funny when you think about, say, hiring a person like a professor, and that professor has to be Indigenous. Well, how in heaven's name is that helping Indigenous people? That professor is already a middle-class, privileged, successful person, and you are not doing anything to address the real problem. The real problem is we have a very large underclass of unemployed and even unemployable people. For historical reasons, for all sorts of reasons, you have way too many people, Indigenous people, in that category. And many of them are in jails, and the young people are in the child welfare system. That's the problem. It's not finding ways to have more academic professors get bigger paychecks or something like that. So it's almost ludicrous what we're doing, pretending that we're somehow addressing this problem, this very real problem of the Indigenous underclass, by hiring more bureaucrats in Ottawa, or hiring more professors or what have you, simply because they're Indigenous. And then you have people falling all over themselves to show how Indigenous they are. Or now it even gets, it goes into the realm of the ridiculous when you have, for instance, the Métis groups that are fighting with each other to establish that they're Métis and the other one is not Métis. I've a good Métis friend, and he just refuses to have anything to do with that. He's got a Indigenous grandmother. He says, so what? I mean, that can be your interesting family history. Like I would have my own family history, but to try to make money from your DNA is not something that should happen in a country like Canada. So the pretendians, yeah, I'm making fun of everybody. I'm making fun of anybody who would take such a system seriously, where you're going to hire people based on their race instead of on merit. And I'm making fun of the people, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, who would compete and compete using their DNA as some sort of bargaining chip. I think it's wrong, and I don't think we should be doing it.
Yeah, it certainly does have far-reaching impacts that are mostly bad. I know you're probably aware recently that Dr. Jordan Peterson announced that he was resigning his tenure from the University of Toronto. And the reason why he did it, he said that he could not in good conscience take on graduate students who, despite being very bright and talented and well suited for academic life, had no chance of getting tenure or becoming full-time professors, because they could not meet these sectarian requirements. More than that, I have a bit of a biased picture of this myself, because I was actually the subject or the target, not the victim, of a cancel culture attack over the very thing that you describe. A couple of years ago, I was appointed to a board to select provincial court judges like you, and I made a public pledge on social media that I would not select anyone on the basis of, let's call them immutable characteristics, that I would pick them, that I said to have a position as important as a judge, and I hope you'll agree with this, we have to have our best people. To put someone in a position of with that kind of authority, that kind of power to impact people's lives, and I think this has been revealed through the COVID period, to have people there who are not the best of our people, the most qualified, is simply dangerous and irresponsible for the society. And so it's not only do these programs not do anything, as you rightly point out, to raise the station or the level for the most vulnerable or the least privileged in these particular victim classes, but they also lock out some of the best people who could actually be doing justice for everyone. So yeah, I get your point there. Is there anything else that you want to talk about, you'd like to say, or any other pieces that you've written on this topic that we haven't mentioned that you'd like to comment upon? I have some other things I want to ask you about before we shift gears, I want to be able to let you finish off the topic.
Well, a recent example of what we're talking about right now is happening in the Ilya Shapiro case in the United States, where a very highly qualified law professor has been canceled, if you like. And in his case, he was critical of the decision by the American president to say, I'm going to appoint a black woman to the Supreme Court. And he said, basically, he said he didn't choose his words as well, but he's saying exactly what I just said, exactly what you just said. We should get the best person. If that happens to be a black woman, that's fine. Appoint that person. But what we should be doing is appointing the best person to a job like that. The last thing you'd want to do for something as important as a Supreme Court appointment is to limit your pool so much. But that's the era we're living in. And if you remember back to 2015, Trudeau told us that's exactly what we were going to get. One of the first things he did was decide that he would have his cabinet would be 50% female. Mm-hmm. And in spite of the fact that the women represented something like 25% of elected MPs, he was going to deliberately limit his pool to 50% women, just to make his ideological point. And I think that was a good taste of what was to come. And that's the world we're living in now, where unfortunately your race and your gender and your sexual orientation are somehow said to define you, instead of looking at you and saying, well, are you a good lawyer, or are you a good whatever? They look at your skin color and your gender, etc. And what we're doing is very wrong. The Martin Luther, just as I look back to Pierre Trudeau as essentially having the right idea, and Jean Chrétien, let's not leave Jean Chrétien out of this, because he was a very young Indian Affairs Minister at the time, and he was very much involved with that white paper. As you know, he had an adopted Indigenous son, so he had a special interest. But in the same way, we're making a fundamental error by with this obsession with race, whether a person's Indigenous or not, or black, or whatever color you happen to be. And so, just as I think of somebody way back then, Pierre Trudeau, was having essentially the right idea about equality, and not equity. I didn't say equity, I said equality. I think of Martin Luther King. He got it right. When he said that we should be living in a world where a person's skin color is virtually you don't even see it. You're colorblind. Well, that is the world we should be living in. That's the world we were heading into. But somehow we got sidetracked on this obsession with race and skin color and all of these other things. And that's not the world we should be living in. We should be dismantling that. We should not be having all of these racial bias sessions and that sort of thing. And I know the lawyers are even all caught up in this stuff. That is junk. That is garbage. And we should get rid of it. And we should go back to our colorblind world and treat people as individuals and not as black people or white people or indigenous people, etc. So that's
I quite agree with you. The Martin Luther King quotation that sticks with me is that what matters is the content of your character, not the color of your skin. That your immutable characteristics are the least important things about yourself. Unfortunately, modern day race baiters like Ibram X. Kendi, who are making a lot of money off of purveying this stuff, would say that race blindness, which is the same ethos that I was raised with, is something that's exhibited by somebody who's not aware of their latent, deep-seated white supremacy. But the other thing I thought of when you mentioned the example of Ketanji Jackson in the United States, what's really sad about that is that if Joe Biden hadn't said that he was going to select a black woman, and we have to give him credit for at least knowing what a woman is, if he hadn't said that, the person that he selected, Ketanji Jackson, as much as I disagree with her politics, I could never have looked at her record as a legal scholar or as a judge and said, well, this person is fundamentally unqualified to sit on the Supreme Court. And the sad part about it is, she'll always have this mark on her now that for many people, she was selected only because of the color of her skin. And that really, that's almost, dishonest and a slight upon her, because she's obviously worked very hard to get through law school and to be a very, very successful person to rise to that level. She didn't get there by accident. Her politics may have helped, but the thing is, putting this label on her, it certainly doesn't help her at all, does it? And so this whole thing all around is just it's just wholly bad, isn't it?
Well, I think so. This is what the book.
Oh, great book.
Absolute great book, and he has a great discussion of exactly this type of thing. Excuse me. Douglas Murray has a way of being about 2 years ahead of whatever is happening.
Yes.
He can tell you what's coming down the pipe. I don't know how he does it. In his last The Madness of Crowds,
yes,
he pointed out exactly what was going to happen with, for instance, the fracturing of the LGB group with the T group, which is playing out right now.
Yes.
And he's telling us what's going to happen in the next year or so. So I highly recommend it.
Oh yes. Well, we normally do the reading list at the end, but you've jumped the shark, which is great. The Strange Death of Europe, his first book, or the first of the. I would say those books are almost a trilogy. Those are all excellent, and I strongly recommend them. Thanks for pointing them out. So let's shift gears a little bit. Sure. And talk about some other controversial topics that you've written about extensively. Let's turn to this little thing about COVID-19 that you've been writing about. So let's start with something like vaccine passports. This has, of course, been very much in the news. As you know, just today there was a press conference. It was announced that at long last, under intense pressure, there's been at least a momentary suspension of the momentary suspension of the government's illegal suspension of Section 6 mobility rights under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But you wrote a column last April of 2021 about why vaccine passports are a bad idea. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I started writing pretty early on in the pandemic. For one thing, gave me
I saw that. I saw that. You want to start there about why you did that and what you
Sure.
saw early on?
The vaccine passports, and I was particularly interested in what Sweden was doing. And Tegnell and his mentor just made way more sense to me. Now, I'm not a doctor. I have no medical training. I'm not a scientist. But basically what they were doing is taking the old-fashioned approach that had been used for the past 50 years to deal with pandemics. And they were saying things like, well, first of all, let's see how this develops. But the last thing we want to do is panic people. The last thing we want to do is destroy the economy. The economy is absolutely vital because we have no idea at that point. They didn't know how bad this virus was going to be. So they took a very common sense approach, while everybody else was just completely setting the system on its head and setting everybody home and emptying the public treasury to send checks to people. Sweden was just taking a very common sense approach. They never closed their schools. As a matter of fact, the Northern Europeans don't even believe in masks. Their philosophy on masks was a little different from ours. They said, well, masks actually stop people from social distancing properly. So they didn't believe in masks. The kids went to school in the normal way, and at the end of the day, no children have died, and teachers got sick at about the same rate as they were getting sick from the grocery clerks who were selling them their groceries. So all in all, and I won't go through all of that, I'm sure you're very, very familiar with the Swedish statistics. And they were bombarded every time I wrote one of these columns about how Sweden was doing things, and they seemed to be not suffering the same ill effects that we were. There would be all sorts of just absolutely angry replies. Instead of saying, well, we should be looking at them because we can compare Sweden with what we're doing, instead it became sort of a battle. I couldn't quite understand it. There was sort of an emotional component. But anyway, I was very interested in what Sweden and some of the other countries that did not resort to the lockdown. They did not resort to the massive public redistribution of money that we did in Canada. After all, we spent more per capita on income redistribution than any country in the world. So we just went crazy with sending checks to people, and at great cost to society for very little benefit. So I was very interested in what they were doing. And when vaccine passports, when that started to be talked about, I listened to the Prime Minister, and he said, no, vaccine passports are not a good idea for many reasons, but they're very divisive, and it's just not something we should do. So that's what he said. And then he completely changed his tune, and I suspect it had a lot to do with the election that was coming up that he might lose. In any event, what's happened in this country, I believe, is very unfortunate, because we have a badly divided population right now. We have a good segment of the population who is very bitter and very unhappy about what has happened to them. People that can't even, if you can imagine, it can't even fly internally, can't even travel to visit a sick relative on the other side of the country because they're unvaccinated. They choose not to be vaccinated. And you have, on the other hand, you've got that people who are just rabidly angry at anybody who chooses not to get a vaccination, or somebody who comes to Ottawa to protest this. And so we have tremendous division. It could have been very easily avoided. And I absolutely believe that right from the beginning of this thing, we should have given citizens the right to decide what health measures they wanted to take. That includes how much they wanted to stay home and avoid crowds, etc. But that also would include whether or not they wanted to be vaccinated, whether they wanted their children to be vaccinated. I don't believe in this case, especially where it does not appear that this vaccine really has much, makes much difference in terms of the transmission of the disease. I don't believe that the government should be mandating this at all. It's beginning to look very much like, yes, perhaps a person who chooses not to be vaccinated may be more sick than somebody who's vaccinated. That's a question for the scientists, but I mean, that's their own business that they choose not to be vaccinated, and knowing that they might get sicker, well, that's their business. But I believe that vaccine mandates were one of the worst decisions that have ever been made by a Canadian government. And I think we're only now seeing all of the effects. And I think they will be long term. I think the country has actually been permanently damaged by what has happened. And I don't think we have to go into the Emergency Act fiasco or the treatment that this particular government gave to its own citizens in attaching their bank accounts and persecuting them, and in even stopping them from traveling. So we are internationally, this particular government has done terrible damage to our reputation internationally. I don't think this is something that's going to be easily solved, and I think we have a fractured country, and it's going to be that way for a long time.
Well, as a corollary to that analysis, I'm curious to get your take on why the Prime Minister, and I point to the Prime Minister because I really see not just with this Prime Minister, but perhaps it's never been more obvious with this Prime Minister, a concentration of political power in the Prime Minister's office. And when Brian Peckford was on this program, he talked about this. But I'm interested to know, Brian, your take on why the Prime Minister seemed to be hell-bent on making these vaccine mandates, the hill that he was going to die on. Why is he hung on to these so from his very fingertips? And even today, the announcement today is not a removal of these mandates. It's merely, as I understand, it's merely a temporary suspension. And we're being told that federal workers are going to have to get used to in the fall, when Dr. Tam's seventh wave arrives, a regular, periodic, every 6 months boosters. So why is he hanging on to this at really a great risk, not only to our country, but to his own political career? What's your take on that?
I think, and perhaps this is overly cynical, but I believe he did it originally as an election strategy to, first of all, you cause fear, and that's what they did during the whole COVID epidemic. Then after you've whipped up fear, you create division, and you want your majority to be fearful, and you want your majority to regard anybody that doesn't do what they are supposed to do in terms of getting a vaccine or wearing a mask and all that sort of thing as an enemy. So I think in effect he's created a Frankenstein. He doesn't now. You can't easily get rid of this thing because you have at least half of the population convinced that all of these draconian measures they've taken have saved thousands of lives. This is nonsense. This is absolute nonsense. But that's what people believe. And they believe that anybody that does not do what they think they should do, when I'm talking about take a vaccine every couple of months or whatever they want, and wear a mask and comply with all of this, that's their enemy. And those people are anti-vaxxers. And I found this out too. I personally I'm a vaccinated person. I chose to get a vaccine. Yeah, I'm an older person, and I decided for me it was a useful step. Whether it helped me or not, I don't know, but I thought it was useful. But I was absolutely convinced right from the start that this is a personal decision. Everybody should be able to make this decision for himself or herself. And this was not up to a prime minister to tell us whether or not we should be vaccinated. But I do believe that he has now created a situation where people are demanding all sorts of continuation of these very draconian steps. And by now, the idea of civil liberties, if you talk about civil liberties, you're regarded as a right-wing nut. It's sort of been forgotten. So I think if you think back to Canada 2 years ago, before the pandemic struck, I think the country has changed fundamentally. I think we've become a more authoritarian and left-leaning country. It's really odd that a country can change so much, but I do believe we have, and I'm not sure that there's an easy road back, Leighton.
Mm-hmm. Well, in that vein, I'd like you to put on your old judge hat for a minute. I want to talk about some of the judicial decisions that have occurred during the pandemic. As you know, myself and other lawyers in Canada have been bringing these cases before the courts and alleging that many of these draconian measures that you describe, which clearly cause charter violations and are obvious violations of cherished civil liberties, are nonetheless being upheld on the basis of public policy under Section 1 of the Charter. This happened in your own province. Mr. Justice Joel, in the Gateway decision last year, wrote, honestly, in fairness, one of the weaker decisions I've read recently, where he basically said that he's just a judge and he cannot be an arbiter of science. And although he was presented with a mountain of scientific evidence in support of the case, he simply threw up his hands and said, well, I can't decide what science is correct here. There's obviously a pandemic. He sort of took judicial notice of that and said, the government seems to be doing an okay job of trying to fight it. That doesn't seem to measure up to the standard of the early charter decisions. So I'm interested to know what your take is on that and why you think that judges in British Columbia and Manitoba and Ontario and elsewhere have been so willing to uphold the government's view of the matter, despite these draconian restrictions of Canadian charter freedoms that have been honored since time immemorial, even before the charter.
Well, I found it extremely disappointing, the fact that basically the courts have not been there to protect the rights of the individual. As I understand it, I've always believed a government's first responsibility is to preserve and protect the rights of citizens. And when a citizen feels aggrieved, when a citizen feels that the government has not been doing that properly, then the citizen has a right to resort to a court. And a court is not just to say, oh, well, whatever the government wants, they get. But I am, maybe I'm being unfair because there have been a few exceptions. But generally, the courts have taken the view, well, if the government says it's a public health emergency, they can do whatever they want. And I do have to say that the speech given by the Chief Justice recently was, I found myself absolutely depressed reading what he had said, and so I have to say that our courts have not been protection. South of the border, you have sort of a mixed bag, and I mean everybody's going to have their own view about any particular court case. but the American courts, by and large, have done their job. And I know I'm being very critical here, but I do not think the Canadian courts have.
Right. You were speaking about Chief Justice Wagner of the Supreme Court, and I know you're aware of this, but a group of lawyers, I think 13 lawyers, have actually filed a complaint with the National Judicial Council about those comments, which essentially equated the people who participated in the peaceful protest, the Freedom Convoy, as anti-Canadian terrorists, which was very shocking. I believe it was published in French, in a French publication called Devoir, I believe it was. But again, I share your concern about that because it shows a level of judicial activism that I think someone like Lord Denning would have frowned upon. We, in our system, a judge is supposed to be a fair, impartial, and of course, thinking of just Lady Justice, wearing the blindfold with the scales of justice in her hands. That's what we're supposed to see. And here we have the highest judge in the entire country, and more than that, our former chief judge, who now works in China, seems to hold the same view. She published a piece not long after the Freedom Convoy that essentially said that, as I read it, essentially that the only important charter provision was Section 1. So this is quite concerning, isn't it? I mean, it's a real shift in terms of the approach that judges historically have taken in this country to dispensing justice.
Yes, and of course that's the same former Chief Justice, who also opined over cocktails that residential schools were cultural genocide. That's right. Where the genocide, the genocide claim really was first made by a person in a position of power, and from that point, the genocide hustlers have made that into almost an industry, and I think that was another shocking comment that should never have spoken.
As sort of an adjunct to the COVID-19 pandemic, you've also been an outspoken critic of management of healthcare, and you wrote a piece called "The Real COVID-19 is Really an Obesity Epidemic." And I think what you were saying, I'd like you to speak on this to clarify. I think what you were saying is that COVID-19 and the hysteria around it was really masking a whole host of other very serious and soluble healthcare problems. Is that a fair assessment of that piece when you wrote it?
Yeah. When this whole thing started, when the pandemic started, our political leaders had said, okay, well, we know even at this stage that the healthier you are, the better you're going to be able to withstand this virus. So let's let this be an opportunity to start getting people into better physical shape, because we Canadians are an unfit, obese people. We are, and we found out during the COVID epidemic how dangerous being overweight was, being obese was, because your chances of dying if you're obese are just astoundingly higher than if you are healthy and fit. So just imagine if we had said, okay, let's use this as an opportunity to get people into better shape and get people outdoors, exercising in the sunshine, get them more vitamin D. Let's concentrate on protecting our vulnerable people, that is the elderly people. So let's put money into the nursing home system, which is not very good, and we can fix that up. Let's put billions into our very weak and fragile hospital system, because we have so little surge capacity. Well, we didn't do any of those things. What did we do? Our health people said, stay indoors. And they even closed playgrounds for children. They closed golf courses in some places. It was quite insane. They said stay indoors. They didn't say anything about your health or trying um, uh, to maintain a better body weight. They did very little about protecting the nursing home population, especially in the first couple of months. They did practically nothing. They were sending out checks, deliberately unemploying young, healthy people, sending them home to their basements, and not properly protecting the nursing home population, which is really quite insane. And they didn't really do anything to build up our hospital surge capacity. They missed a golden opportunity. Now, cynically again, excuse me, I would suggest that this is politics. Much of this was politics. The prime minister, the Liberal Party, doesn't get that much benefit from giving money over to provincial leaders so that they can, sorry, do their jobs better with nursing homes and hospitals. Instead, the federal government wanted to be the hero by sending out these CERB payments, etc. So it was an opportunity lost, as far as I'm concerned.
I had the unique opportunity here in Alberta to actually cross-examine our Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Dina Hinshaw, a couple of months ago, and I questioned her specifically on this obesity issue. I put it to her on cross-examination that nearly 8 in 10 of the people who were presented at hospitals with serious COVID symptoms were morbidly obese. And I asked her the very questions that you just put, and her answer was was rather shocking. She said that when I asked her why we couldn't promote health and, for example, provide diet plans or provide fitness ideas for people, get them outside and moving out in the sunshine, she said, well, that would have stigmatized them, that would have offended them. And then she also described obesity strangely as an endemic health condition over which people have no control. And so I think that was a very telling picture when you have the top doctor in Alberta who swore in her affidavit that she regarded every Albertan as her patient. When you're getting that kind of health advice, that begins to tell the story of why things are not very good. In Alberta and Manitoba and other provinces throughout Canada, we're just not very healthy, and our healthcare system is not doing a very good job of helping us to, as you put it, maintain our health and prevent the need for this hospital care, this extreme care that was talked so much about during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Well, it's also an example of where sort of woke philosophy actually is actually deadly. It's actually deadly because the idea is, well, you should not stigmatize people and that sort of thing. Well, obviously, you should not make fun of people for being overweight, etc. But at the same time, you should be honest with people and saying that, particularly with this COVID virus, the more obese you are, the more deadly this virus is for you. So to not tell people that and not to promote participation type of programs actually killed people. And there's no way of knowing exactly how many, but that's an example of where the actions of these public officials has actually been deadly. I stand behind that article because I had all of the statistics, and you said yes, and I think that's basically what I said, and it went even further in the public message from the newspapers, for instance. I'll give you an example. They did not want to promote the idea that, well, the healthier and younger you are, the less danger this virus was to you. Instead, they, for some reason, wanted to push the idea that the virus was equally dangerous to everybody. And the young people. So I know I read an article in the paper in Winnipeg Free Press, and it wanted to show that yes, young people can get very sick from COVID as well. So they had an article about a woman who was at least 100 pounds overweight, and they were trying to pass this off as young people get very sick from this disease. Well, no, uh, she was morbidly obese. That was the health issue. The fact that she was a young person. It's not young people are in terrible danger. It's obese people are in danger. But the newspaper was deliberately distorting this message. So I was unable to understand why our government would not, because they knew it from the beginning, make a real point of saying, look, if you are an elderly person with comorbidities, you're in terrible danger from this virus. So we have to take measures, you have to take measures, etc. But if you are young and healthy, you don't have much to fear. You might get sick. Sometimes you might get really sick, but usually if you're healthy, you're going to be able to deal with this. And that's exactly what has eventually happened. People now get COVID, and if you're young and healthy, then basically you shake it off fairly quickly. We're going to have this thing for the rest of our lives. There's no doubt about it. The variations of this are going to be here. But why the government refused to tell us that when their health advisors certainly were telling them the truth, why they were insisting that we should adopt some type of COVID zero policy or some weird variation of it. I'm still not able to understand, Leighton. They obviously knew that the information they were giving was not the correct information. The only thing I can think of is that we sort of moved directly from a point where the government was trying to convince everybody that you have to do all of this lockdown thing. Then the vaccine came along, and they wanted to give the message that this vaccine was going to sort of save the day. Well, it didn't. It became apparent pretty early on that no, those claims about the vaccine stopping transmission of the disease were simply not true. By the time we developed that vaccine, the virus had moved on. It's always ahead of us. It already morphed into something different, less deadly and more contagious. And I suspect that's the way it's going to continue to evolve. But the government refused to tell us that. Instead, they gave us this information, which was not true. They were telling people this, that they were giving people misinformation. There's no other way of saying it. Now they seem to have locked themselves into this permanent lockdown mentality mode, where I have no doubt that as soon as we get some more infections in fall, we're going to be seeing we have to have more lockdowns, and we have to have mask mandates, and everybody has to have more vaccines and that sort of thing. So I think we're really a hopeless spiral. I'm not sure how we get out of this, because now we have the population basically braying for all of this stuff. They half the population is insisting that we should be vaccinating even little wee kids. It'll be babies next, I suppose. So the government has created, it really has created a monster, a Frankenstein, and I'm not sure how they can climb out of this, how any of us can climb out of it.
This reminds me of a lecture that I saw Dr. Jordan Peterson give when he was out promoting his book, 12 Rules for Life, an antidote to chaos. We sort of need an antidote to chaos right now. But he was talking about how oftentimes bureaucrats, especially governments, when they're faced with a complex problem, they tend to glom on to quick and easy solutions. And I'm drawing the analogy here of what you just said about the vaccine being the panacea to the COVID-19 problem. And what Dr. Peterson pointed out, which I think has proven to be quite accurate, is that when you don't do the work and when you don't consider carefully the cost benefit analysis of glomming onto this quick fix, what you end up with is, pardon the pun, injecting a whole another level of complication into an already complex system. And then what you have is, as you say, the Frankenstein. You're sort of electrocuting the Frankenstein is the slab on the table. You electrocute the Frankenstein, and now he's out. And so this seems to be a great example of what Dr. Peterson was talking about, is how when you go for this quick fix solution, you tend to make the original problem worse, and then you create a whole host of new problems that you didn't imagine when you went for the quick fix solution. So I'm mentioning this by segue. Now I want you to talk about another article that you wrote about why past pandemics were handled with more common sense than this one. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I wrote an essay. I think it was I've forgotten exactly where it was, but
I can tell you it was in May of 2021 is the one I have.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
that might be the one. I wrote quite a few of them, maybe too many,
Yeah.
but I wanted to learn a little bit more about the history of pandemics, and I went back to. And we won't go to the Black Death or the Spanish flu of 1918. Those were terrible epidemics. But by the way, and just as not that it makes any difference, but both of those would have been entirely different if they had antibiotics, because of course in the 19 flu, as well as in the Black Death, antibiotics would have cut the deaths. Probably they would have deaths were 10 times what they would have been if there had been antibiotics. So that's apropos of nothing, but it just is an indication that we have modern healthcare now, and it makes a huge difference dealing with these pandemics. So in my lifetime, we had the 1957, and I was just a kid then, but 1957 Hong Kong flu. And then the one I'll talk about for just a minute is the 1969. We're talking about Pierre Trudeau. This is around the same time.
Summer of love.
Yeah, well, that's what it is. And that's the interesting thing. I suppose you've anticipated my point, because I was a young man at that time. This was, and we had a pandemic that killed a number of million people worldwide. It wasn't that much different in terms of total deaths as this one, but that was the summer of love. That's exactly right. That was Woodstock. And now I was young, I wasn't paying much attention to that type of thing anyways, but if you could just think about all of those people together, very close together. This is Woodstock.
Yeah. I didn't see any masks there on the old footage.
There's none. And people were, the point is, people were basically just living their lives. Yes, some of there would have been very strict measures at the nursing homes. That only makes sense, where you because those people, if they get almost any disease, it can kill them. But young people, there was no even knowledge that this is going on. Well, why was that? Why was that? Well, because of the world leaders and the decisions that they made. I look back at some of the debates among the American president Nixon and Eisenhower before that, and they said, okay, number one, we don't want to panic the population. You can't panic the population. You've got to keep life as normal as possible. And you've got to keep the economy going, because you don't know how bad this thing is. And the last thing you want to do is destroy the economy. And then you've got to protect the vulnerable populations. And you go to the nursing homes and you take your steps, normal steps. And that's what they did. And the virus went through the community. Herd immunity was was achieved, etc. And people went on with their lives. And those were exactly what the pandemic plans, even up to this pandemic, were supposed to do. Now, I've worked with David Redmond. I don't know if you've had
Oh yes, oh
David
yes.
on
He
here.
he was witness for us in the Ingram
He's
case. Yeah,
excellent.
he's
David
yeah,
is an excellent friend, but he's a pandemic
yeah.
specialist, and
Oh
he's a
yes, yeah.
colonel, and he presents these plans, the old style plan.
Hmm.
That's basically what it said. I won't go through the points again, but it's
Hmm.
just all common sense stuff. And you
Right.
don't put you put your emergency planners in charge. You don't and get the whole civil service making all kinds of rules and that sort of thing the way we did. We've made a terrible mess in Canada of the way we did it.
Hmm.
You get your emergency plans in place, then you get life going on as normally as possible. No, you don't close schools. If there's a really bad flu, and this wasn't like a flu for kids, it was especially easy on kids, but you don't close schools unless you absolutely had to for short periods of time. No, you don't send healthy young workers home and deliberately deliberately unemploy them and then send them checks for years. You don't do any of those things. You keep your economy going. Very similar to what we know as the Great Barrington Declaration. It's
Hmm.
common sense stuff. And that's basically what Sweden did. Sweden
Right.
made a few mistakes by not protecting its, shutting down its, or locking down its nursing homes. And they admit it. They made those mistakes, but they never closed their schools. They didn't deliberately unemploy people, and they kept life as normal as possible. And they've done way better than we have. So
Hmm.
though that was the pandemic plan right up until this pandemic hit, and then for reasons which I don't think we're going to know about for years, the leaders panicked and they decided to turn the economy on its head and do everything uh, uh, contrary to the plans. The idea of lockdown was at one time ridiculed by WHO. You weren't supposed to do such a thing, but for reasons we won't find out for quite a while, until this group of leaders is no longer in office, they
Hmm.
upended everything, and they've made a terrible mess of things. So that's my take on it, Leighton. And
Hmm.
so I was writing about these issues uh, uh, for some time. So that
Hmm.
I've sort of given you more than what you asked for there.
And I'm
But
grateful for
but so I'll let you ask some questions
it.
before
Well,
going.
I want to follow up on this concept of common sense and maybe tie that back in with some of Douglas Murray's writings, because the war on the West, in there he talks about really what is often called the culture war,
Mhm.
and the war is on Western culture. And I see that the kind of common sense that you're talking about, the way you were describing it, is something that we took for granted. It was part of Western culture, the approach that we took as a society to solving problems, as you were describing back, with President Nixon, President Eisenhower. That has fundamentally changed, and common sense is becoming increasingly uncommon, at least what we used to call it. In fact, um, that term has been described as within the category of white supremacy by the woke mob. So, what's in your view? First of all, what's driving this attack on Western culture? And secondly, in your view, based on your vast experience as a judge and a journalist and a citizen of Canada, what can we do about it? What can we do in our daily lives to try and combat this and get back to being a country where we can have civil discourse, where we can deal with these difficult problems in a way that isn't full of so much conflict?
Well, I think doing what we're doing right now, and having discussions and talking about some of these things. Um, if you've seen Matt Walsh's "What Is a Woman,"
Oh
uh,
yeah, brilliant. It's
because
brilliant.
basically what he does, and I'm not going to go into that topic particularly, but what he does is he just asks some questions, common sense questions, and some of these more ridiculous claims just come falling down. Even these people who are supposed to be know what they're doing about these talking about these academics who spoke some of this nonsense, they can't even explain it. And in that example, he's exposing this ridiculous notion that a man can become a woman just by saying he's a woman. So that's what he with there. But that's just the most extreme example of some of the what really is nonsense. And this whole idea, I've already said this, but I'll repeat it again. This whole idea that we're supposed to be at racial war with each other is complete nonsense, and we should just say so. You know, one of the things, I'm a boomer. I'm in the boomer generation, okay? And we did a lot of things wrong. But one thing we did that was right was because we lived through the civil rights era, we were able to teach our children properly, and the teachers taught the children properly about racial matters, so that our children and my grandchildren are the least racist people probably in the history of the world. Never have we had such little racism in Canada, and yet somehow these people want to bring it all back. These people want to start inventing a racial problem where it doesn't exist. My grandchildren don't even, when they go to a school where there are quite a few kids from different countries, they don't even notice. They don't even notice because the racial stuff is just not even on their radar. So why would we possibly want to make them hyper conscious of racial differences? And so I think part of the answer to the question is just getting people thinking about these things and not be afraid to say that's nonsense. So if somebody says to you, if somebody says to me, well, you have to be an anti-racist. You can't have this colorblind attitude because that's racist. I'll just tell them to go to hell, because that's nonsense. And if somebody says, well, I'm transphobic because I refuse to say that a man who says he's a woman is a woman. Well, I'll say, no, that's nonsense. I know the difference between a man and a woman. I know I'm not a racist, etc. So I think it's people sort of doing a little thinking and not being just followers. Don't just follow along with something. And if you know something is nonsense, don't be afraid to say so. And that maybe is my single biggest fault. I've got into trouble over that, Leighton. But no, it's a very pervasive problem, because we've had that in our schools, and particularly our universities now for many years. And this whatever you would call it, hyper progressive or woke philosophy is deeply ingrained, but it comes down to the little boy that saw the emperor, and the emperor wasn't wearing any clothes, and saying so, telling that whole crowd, no, there's no clothes there, that man's naked. And that's really what it comes down to. Everybody has to do that on an individual basis.
It reminds me a little bit of one of Jordan Peterson's rules. I think it's number 6: tell the truth, or at least don't lie. That seems to be the key to common sense, right?
You're also a devotee of Jordan Peterson.
I think he's the most. Yeah, I think he's the most important public intellectual, certainly Canadian public intellectual of our time. And yet, he's vilified in our own country. It's horrifying, really. I think that his books, 12 Rules for Life and Beyond Order, should be required reading. I've said this before on the program, required reading for every high school student in Canada. I think that would go a long way towards alleviating some of the intense confusion and conflict that you're talking about. I agree with you. It seems to be so unnecessary and designed to cause harm. And of course, Douglas Murray talks about that in his book too, doesn't he?
Yeah.
About how this is all designed to set people up in conflict. But it has, it has a very pervasive effect. In fact, you've even written about how a big part of what made the COVID-19 lockdown era, if we can call it worse, was the amount of incivility that we had, where we couldn't have conversations about things like, well, should we close stores? What would happen if people couldn't go to church, right? We couldn't have civil conversations about that. We couldn't even talk about what the correct science was. We had Dr. Jay Bhattacharya in this program to talk about that, about truth in science and how that's been suppressed by people like Dr. Fauci. So what you're talking about, this common sense, I really equate it with truth, and it has a very pervasive impact. Anyway, Brian, I want to thank you for being with us today. You've been just brilliant. I really enjoyed talking with you. Before we close off the program, I wonder if you could tell us where people could go to find more of your writings. We've talked about the Frontier Center for Public Policy. Are there other places where people can go to find your work?
In the last year, I've been writing a lot about the so-called missing children and unmarked graves controversy.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I don't know if you want to discuss that at all, but
no, let's do that now. I'd love to hear about this.
All right. Well,
yeah.
I won't take up too much of your time with that.
No. We'll take all the time you need.
We began looking at, and I say we because I'm sort of associated with a group of they're academics, writers, researchers, etc., that have sort of came together after that announcement last May from Kamloops about the missing children and the children who were supposedly buried in the apple orchard at Kamloops. I wrote a column for the Winnipeg Sun. I used to write columns for the Winnipeg Sun. And I basically said, let's just hold our horses here, because what they're talking about is extremely unlikely. And I talked about death from disease 100 years ago, et cetera, and how the world was very different then. But it had an extremely negative reaction because, or at least from some people, because people were just completely taken up in what I can only describe as a sort of a national hysteria. If you think about back into that time, and the flag was being flown at half-mast for months, etc., and there were churches being burnt. Supposedly, people were so angry at priests and nuns for killing children and secretly burying them. Well, that never happened. Those are conspiracy theories. And I quickly, as I think I saw what was going on, there's a very legitimate search. People want to know where their ancestors are buried. Well, that's very legitimate, and I absolutely support that. But this is all caught up in crazy conspiracy theories about 6-year-olds being forced to bury children that the priests have murdered, and priests throwing children into furnaces, and all sorts of just absolutely irresponsible, anti-Catholic conspiracy theories. That's basically what they are. So I began to write about it, and so did the other people in our group. So there are various places where these writings and essays are found, and you can Google my name and or the name of Tom Flanagan.
Mm-hmm.
Another person that writes is Francis Widowson. Jaime Rubenstein is another person, an associate, and everybody has their different take on it. But they can be found in the Frontier. A number of my essays are in the Frontier Center for Public Policy, the Dorchester Review, C2C Journal. True North, and various other publications. But I do urge people to keep an open mind and read as much as you can on this subject. It's become very clear to me that this claim that Canada is a genocidal country is doing us a huge amount of damage. You know, just an example, Leighton, Canada was playing a very important role in the campaign to bring light on the Uyghur issue in China, where the Uyghurs are being treated absolutely horribly. Well, Canada's reputation is now in tatters in those countries, because you can imagine how the Chinese Communist government has used these claims about genocide and murder and secret burial. These claims are untrue. The genocide claims are absolutely untrue. I just urge people to do their reading on the subject and not get swept along in these what are basically conspiracy theories. So I'll probably I should probably leave it at that, rather than try to go into detail. It's a complex area for sure.
Right. I'll just add to that, Brian. I spent about a dozen years. I was involved in the original Indian residential schools class action. I represented hundreds of claimants in that process, and I was involved in the settlement negotiations with Mr. Justice Yakabuchi in the early 2000s. And I cannot recall ever hearing about this Kamloops residential school or any of these stories. And to me, that is really, it's consternating and it's incongruous, because at that time, you know, you had plaintiff lawyers who had a great interest in bringing these claims to light. And of course, you know, to have this sort of pop up out of the blue many years later, I would say is dubious, to say the least. So I share your concerns about that, and also I don't have to imagine what the Chinese would say, because I've read some things that they've said publicly about Canada, and this is what they say. This is precisely what they say when we try and call them out publicly for their legitimate human rights abuses. They say, well, what about residential schools, and what about Kamloops, and so on. And so, of course, this gets back at what you've written about, you know, the irreparable, and you've talked about today, this sort of irreparable damage that the Trudeau government has really done to our country and its reputation and its people. I agree with you that our people sadly have changed. There are many, many wonderful people in this country that make up the vast majority. But we're not as united around a grand narrative about our country as we once were, and that saddens me as somebody who grew up in this country really believing it, and being proud and being patriotic. It's very hard to be patriotic nowadays. You got to dig pretty deep, you know. But no, thanks for that. I think that those are great resources, and people should go and find out, you know, the truth about those things. Well, Brian, we're coming to the point now that I call the reading list, and I'm gonna ask you to provide us with some suggestions about, you know, perhaps a resource or two. You've already done. I know you got a couple of books there that you've already mentioned, and I'm going to give you the final word. But this is the point of the show where we sort of try and leave people with some resources, some places where they can go to further this discussion if they wanted to find out more about some of the things that you've talked about today. So I'm going to go first, and then I'm going to give you the final word.
Sure.
So the book that I have chosen is one that you've referenced in your own writings. And this is a book by Peter Best that I know is very familiar to you. It's called There Is No Difference. And the subtitle is An Argument for the Abolition of the Indian Reserve System and Special Race-Based Laws and Entitlements for Canadian Indians. And the description reads that this book exposes the unrealistic demands made by Canadian Indians to be treated as a nation Indians represented 4% of the population, but they burn up a huge percentage of the federal budget. And the author here, Mr. Best, wants to see the Indians integrated into the greater Canadian society, where they take more responsibility for their own lives. And he shows how the reserve structure has been a colossal failure that offers no future for the children born into it. Of course, you've talked about that and elaborated upon that here today. So that's my suggestion. I'll turn it over to you, and perhaps you can point us to, if you want to talk about Douglas Murray's book or anything else, please feel free. It's open floor.
Okay, well, I've the last couple of years I've become a real podcast junkie, and to practice what I preach and trying to be more active and not just sit on my aging butt all day, I tend to listen to podcasts when I'm hiking or when I'm riding my bike or skiing and that type of thing. So I won't go through my whole list of podcasts, but I just urge people who have not really gotten into the world of podcasts to investigate it. It can be free. I mean, you can subscribe if you want, but you can do this free. And as I say, you can do it while you're walking or while you're writing or riding or riding a bicycle or skiing or snowshoeing, whatever you want. So I highly recommend it. In terms of books, well, some of the people from this group I'm associated with, the best single book on Indigenous issues, I think, is still Tom Flanagan's First Nations Second Thoughts. Now, it's been around a long time, but it's still an excellent resource. Frances Widdowson has written excellent books. Her Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry is still a classic. I recommend it. It's a number of years old, but it's still valid. And her Separate but Unequal is also a very good book. So those are a couple of books to start with. I was going to mention Peter Best's, who is a friend, Peter Best's book, but you've already beaten me to the punch. There's a big meaty book you can sink your teeth into.
Yeah. Well, as for Professor Flanagan, we mentioned his book actually very recently on another episode. He was on our reading list. So I'm certainly a fan of his work, and I also share your enthusiasm for podcasts. And for anyone who wants to subscribe to this one, if you've enjoyed what you've heard today, you can do that too. Brian, it's been an absolute pleasure having you here. And we've enjoyed talking with you. I think we've had a very meaningful conversation. I know I've learned a lot from talking to you and from your wisdom and your many years studying the things that you've talked about. And really, what I appreciate the most about you is your honesty. Sadly, that's becoming more and more rare. It's something that I think we all need to get back to, having honest conversations where we don't have to worry about offending each other. We can have civil conversations. We can disagree. And I haven't agreed with everything that you said, although I must say most of it sounds pretty much in my wheelhouse. But in any event, I just want to thank you for taking the time to be with us today and to share your knowledge and your wisdom and your time with our viewers.
It was a pleasure, and enjoy your summer, Leighton.
Thank you, Brian.
Bye-bye.